All right, I think we are live. Welcome, folks. Today, next episode of How Things Work, number 6. Today, before we get into it, podcast, informational purposes only. Nothing said here should be interpreted as an offer to buy or sell securities, financial advice, legal advice, or as an opinion of the employees at which basically anywhere anyone works. And then lastly, our guests or I may hold positions in the companies or projects discussed. So with that out of the way, welcome to How Things Work. I'm Patrick. I started Commonware. And the podcast here, How Things Work, is about getting into really how these interesting blockchain techniques and mechanisms that are coming online work under the hood. So it's starting from a high level, like what is, in this case, like what is basically block ordering, like transaction ordering, how did things actually get into a blockchain, going into some of the nuances around that, and then seeing where we end up from that. And who better to explore it with our two guests today, Max and Ashwin from Anza, who just released a really interesting proposal last week called Constellation for Solana. So with that, if you guys could give a quick introduction, maybe Max, if you want to kick it off.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Max. I have been working on MEV and blockchain related stuff for about 4 or 5 years now. I've been at Anza for about 1.5 years, and oftentimes Anza, I think, doesn't get a whole lot of press outside of the Solana ecosystem, but basically we work almost 100% on the core Solana protocol and on the Agave client, which is one of the clients that powers it. And the lineage there is, it used to be a lot of the devs who, like Ashwin, were working at Solana Labs on the Labs client. At a certain point, there was a decision point which said, let's move these guys over to Anza so that they can focus 100% on the client. Also happens to be around when the outages stopped happening.
Your commentary on all that, yeah. But go ahead.
But yeah, so basically we work on the core protocol. Ashwin?
Yeah, I'm Ashwin. I've been working on Solana for about 5 years now. So first joined Solana Labs in 2021, and then we spun out into Anza 3 years ago. So I'm on core engineering, specifically targeting consensus. So the point at which blocks are added to the blockchain, coordination happens between the multiple nodes, and we get a finalized view of the state. So I currently lead the consensus team on the engineering side at Anza.
So Ashwin is the guy who has to actually build all these.
You guys write the papers, and then you have to give the timelines, is what it sounds like. Yeah. Sounds fun. So you've seen some shit then over the years, it sounds like.
I have, yeah.
No gray hair, so I don't know. Maybe you just keep cooler than most.
But yeah, we've made phenomenal progress. Back in 2020 and 2021, lots of outages, under a lot of DOS attacks, a lot of bugs that were fixed, performance improved, and now the Agave client is a lot more world-class and stable.
Yeah, so some interesting backstory here is I actually got into Solana a while ago and have admired it for some time. That was when I was working at Coinbase, and I was working on the Solana integration in the first run of it. And little known fact, but I was the one that had to ask for timestamps in the blocks and also nonces in the transactions for cold storage. And so I'm very sorry for probably all the pain that I have caused over the years, but I'm the guy behind the mask that was the one that required those two things. So
finally getting rid of those this year.
Yeah, we're currently in the process of
not my problem, and I wish you the best to anyone that needs whoever needed those things. But yeah, so the one in all seriousness that I think Solana in my mind really extended the window for what kind of network and performance engineering you could do on the blockchain layer. I think really revisited some of the original architectural decisions of a lot of these P2P style networks from a totally different lens. And it was super refreshing to see. And I think over the last few years, obviously there's growing pains and all sorts of different abstractions that are done. But I think some of the usage of erasure coding and the way that you guys did way back when was way ahead of a lot of the other protocols, at least I had seen at that time. So yeah, super cool to see that come together, and yeah, excited to learn more about the new directions that you guys are going on the research side and the engineering side based on what you've continued to learn. So yeah, with that, let's get right into it. So with a lot of these episodes, I find it useful to start at the highest layer of abstraction and then get into how that works, and then use that to motivate why some of the more recent proposals make sense. So I think the first place to start is, I'm a user and I send a transaction to blockchains. How does that work today? I think most people think of it as I shoot it to some RPC or whatever my wallet does, and then I don't think about it, and then all of a sudden, maybe a few seconds later, less on Solana, maybe I get a notification back that says transaction happened or failed or something. So let's start with that, and like, what is actually happening behind the hood there?
Right. So I guess maybe it's useful to be like, in the beginning, like, what did it look like on Bitcoin? Because a lot of these things are path dependent and have evolved out of that. So on Bitcoin, you would have your RPC, which was like a Bitcoin node. So they're connected to some other peers in the Bitcoin network. And you would send your transaction, which is a signature, the instructions of what you want the transaction to do. And you would send that to the Bitcoin node, and the Bitcoin node would send that transaction to its peers in this sort of fan out until it propagated to the entire network. And that stuff was not confirmed. It was not in the block. It was not part of the ledger yet, but it's just some transactions that you have available in this thing called a mempool. And then when it was time to build a block, you would grab the best transactions you can find in your mempool, which is a local construct, because again, it's not part of the block. It's just which transactions have been propagated to me at the time that I go and reach for it. Then I do it and I build a block that way. So that was how it worked in Bitcoin. Then Ethereum, you started to have a lot more interesting transactions because there's actually stuff to do on the chain. Like you can make a DAO and you can do DeFi and all this stuff. So, and also the speed was faster, but for a while it was just a mempool construction very similar to that. And so they had a very similar peer-to-peer network where if you wanted to send a transaction, you would go to your RPC, which runs a node. It would send it to its friends in the network. Those guys would send it to their friends, and you would have this mempool that formed. Where it started to diverge is with MEVGeth, which was the sort of first MEV client. And what they did is they said, this game of MEV that's going on in the mempool where you just send transactions has a few problems. One of them is you pay the fee even if your transaction fails.
Yep.
Another one is you might want to put transactions together in what's called a bundle that all fail together or succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So things like sandwiches would be one type of bundle. That was the first use case of a bundle. But there are others. And then the third thing was that your transaction might get seen by everybody in the mempool before it gets executed, and there might be some stuff that goes on with that. So they introduced this idea of bundle with MEVGeth. I don't know if
that was all like predicated before that on that. There was that article that dropped, like something about like the dark forest of Ethereum or the mempool or something like that, which I think really opened people's eyes to this problem for the first time. Because prior to that, right, it was a lot of people just doing this very underground, let's say, who did not want to be picked up. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about like also like that it was very unofficial, and then there was this big push to like, actually, let's make this a thing that we're good with. Yeah.
Right. So I think the philosophy back then was this stuff is kind of going on underneath the surface. Nobody knows about it. If we let things happen and evolve in the natural order of things, it'll be very centralizing to Ethereum. And they cared a lot about this. And the idea was that sophisticated players who knew how to extract MEV, knew how to do sandwich attacks on their own validator would have higher rewards. They would attract, which at the time they didn't have proof of stake, they would attract more mining power. And then they would basically centralize the chain. And the way around this was, what if we make it open to everybody? We let everybody have this power by opening up the marketplace. Let everybody do MEV. And that way, no one mining pool will have more MEV power than another, and they won't attract a bunch of stake that way.
Yep.
That was the original logic of it.
And so to confirm, I think just to make it clear, right? The idea was not like, oh, let's find a way to prevent MEV or make it impossible, because that itself was either very difficult or not possible. But instead, what if we just democratize access to creating, like basically generating or deriving MEV from the blocks you build, and then that prevents what could be a centralizing force from sophisticated actors just making a lot more money than small players.
Yeah, broadly the view was basically MEV is inevitable, so we might as well open it up to everybody. Also, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on trading. This was almost before DeFi summer.
Sure.
Off, so there wasn't as much of an emphasis on trading as the real core use case, so it wasn't seen as bad of a thing as it is now.
Yeah. So yeah, we haven't talked much about how this affects like scalability of these chains or the performance of these chains, which is a whole nother thing to, I think, consider. So before we get into that, maybe like let's keep going. So we're at like kind of like this is still pretty niche.
Yeah.
MEVGeth has dropped. Where do we go from here?
So MEVGeth, one of the things about MEVGeth was it required a trust between Flashbots and who was running the bundle auction and the mining pools who were creating the template, which is what they mined off of. So that trust made it so that there was only 3 mining pools that were signed up. It was the 3 big Ethereum mining pools that were signed up, and nobody else could join. And so this was perceived as sort of a threat to the long tail of solo stakers who don't have enough reputation to have this this relationship where you respect the bundles. At that point, the merge was coming up, and so they said we're going to fix it with the merge, and they said we're going to fully make this proposer builder separation a formal protocol that anybody can participate in that's trustless. And the way that they did that was they would hash the block, so you wouldn't see any of the transactions in it. The proposer would sign that block and then broadcast that out. So they would never get to see the transaction content and then make a decision about which block to sign. And then they have slashing. So if you sign 2 blocks, you get slashed. So you would
no slashing for signing an incorrect block because you don't have control over what hash you get, I guess. And then basically the relay is the one that releases the block after you've already signed it. So the idea being that like, oh yeah, if you didn't change it once you see it, you're penalized. Yeah.
Right. Well, an incorrect block, I think they would probably be fine slashing that too, but they just.
I guess that's your risk as someone using one of these things.
Right. Yeah. Like the people who are building PBS were like, can you make sure that it works this way? And the people who were building the merge were like, okay, that's fine. And so I think part of the design of slashing was also in some ways keeping this in mind. And then after the merge happened, very quickly, people took over most of the Ethereum network. And most of the estimates of how much the network is running PBS are actually biased on the low end. So usually it's like 95% or so. But those estimates only look at the percentage of blocks that are proposed by a relay. A lot of people have this sort of, they discount the block from the relay slightly by 90% of the block value just to keep you non-relay blocks around. If you actually look at the number of people running the MEVGeth client or a version of that, there's more than like any of these PBS clients, I think, are more than 95% of the work.
That's a lot of network.
Yeah.
And today, that's pretty much how it fully works on Ethereum. Yeah, and
basically,
you have some history dabbling in these issues in the Ethereum world. Yeah.
So why am I talking about this? Because this was really the departure from the public mempool.
Yeah.
Because I think nowadays on Ethereum, only about 40% of the block value comes through the public mempool at all, or it might be even lower. That was what I knew.
Yeah, I think it's lower even now, but yeah, it was at one point, 40%.
But now that there was this other path where you don't have to reveal your transaction to everyone, it actually gets there faster because it goes directly to the relay and not in this very slow fan out over the peer-to-peer network. Everybody was like, why don't I just do that? And I'm not going to get sandwiched, and I can submit directly. I can get a revert protection, which is really nice, et cetera, et cetera.
Can you explain revert protection? Because I think that's also a pretty funny externality of this whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, basically revert protection says that I will build the block, and as I'm executing your transaction, if it doesn't execute, I will not include it in the block, so you don't have to pay the fee, which is the market structure a lot. In good.
Also, the one where it's like a mev protection too, which is like we'll mev yourself and then give you back the
right. And now, I mean, if you send a transaction, you're lucky if it gets to fewer than 10 intermediaries on Ethereum today because of how complicated this whole cycle has gotten. I mean, you can submit directly to the builder, but you might also submit to CowSwap, which pre-clears your thing, and then they send it to some auction, and then they send it to the builder, and the builder has their own auction, and it's really complicated at this point. And in some sense, it's much darker than it ever was before because all of this stuff is completely private, closed source. You have no idea what's going on. Nobody has the logs. Actually, the ultrasound relay guys were kind enough to give us the internal logs, which is a huge data set. And we never did anything with it, but like there's a huge amount of gaming and interesting stuff that happens inside the relays. Yeah.
There was what was it, like 2 years ago, there was some attack where like someone got the relay to release the block before they like were able to return their signature or something like that. I remember.
Right.
Yeah,
yes.
They're trying to prosecute it as like wire fraud or something crazy. I don't know. It's a wild world out there, I think, with the money in play. Yeah.
This was called the low carb attack.
The low carb crusader. Yeah.
Very interesting events.
Yeah. All right. So the one point I wanted to make on this one is oftentimes people say like, oh, these general purpose blockchains are not optimized for a particular use case. And then you hear stories about how transactions actually get to said general purpose blockchain. And the first question I have is like, is this efficient for like transaction propagation and like user experience? Because it seems like some of these other protocols, like things like Narwhal Tusk, like the kind of like Aptos, DAG line of things, they take a very different approach for like how transactions obviously get into the network with more of a lens towards scaling rather than trying to like maximize the value of any particular transaction. And I think it begs the question if they like, like, can you get one without the other? Like, is this just a natural evolution for how any general purpose blockchain evolves? I'm curious if you guys like have thought about this. And I know maybe this is a good question for Ashwin around like stake weighted quality of service, because I know that was a big change Solana made over this kind of same time period based on some of the transaction dissemination stuff you guys are seeing.
Yeah, I mean, in Solana, we moved away from the mempool approach, right? So when you send a transaction today, it's you sign the transaction and then you forward it directly to the leader, right? And so you might go through an RPC because you don't want to keep track of what is the current block, what is the schedule, who is the next leader. If RPCs offer an abstraction over that, and they'll just forward it, they can retry, handle things like that. But the capability for direct send is there. And then in the early days, we did have some forwarding mechanism where, let's say you were a leader, you receive a transaction, for whatever reason, you can't pack it into the block, or maybe the person who sent it to you was too late. There used to be this mini kind of, okay, we'll forward along your transaction to the next leader or whatever. So that kind of had a little bit of the mempool properties, but these days, I mean, we've removed the forwarding. It's just send it directly to the leader, because also for just the raw amount of messages and transactions we get, the idea that you want to blast these to every single leader, and then sure, it ends up in one leader, makes it into the block, but then the block is also then propagated to everyone again. So you've broadcasted this transaction twice. And then, to Max's point, like the less intermediaries there are between you and the leader, the better, right? Because your transaction details don't get leaked. At that point, the only one, if you send it directly to the leader, the only person that can MEV you is the leader themselves, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned twice with these more like fan out style mempools where it's like a best effort thing. It can be much more than twice that the same transaction gets sent around, and I think that's like it's this balance between like robustness and efficiency, right? Where it's like the robustness of it, like well, there's no coordination of how these transactions get moved around, so it's super robust, right? Like we can all die, and then all of a sudden new nodes pick it up, and the transaction continues to live, which is I think what the Bitcoin people love. The problem is, yeah, when you get into higher throughput, or like the mempool is like a couple thousand, 10,000 transactions, that it becomes much more difficult to actually efficiently do this sort of pre-consensus dissemination of transactions. Yeah.
And it's also like, is that really what the user wants? Where they send out a transaction and then it doesn't end up in the next block or the block after that. Do they really want it to be propagated around and then eventually end up in a block? Or would you rather the RPC or the user just resend the transaction directly to the next leader? Like what is, you squeeze on the latency there and might be a better experience.
I think the other thing too, right, is all these machines have limited bandwidth, and for the user transaction, it's a free ride around the network in this mempool, right? And so if you're trying to optimize things, like ultimately you need some sort of resource constraint. Otherwise, like it's just an unbounded DOS waiting to happen. And so it's interesting that at least in a traditional mempool, a transaction kind of just like the fee itself should pay people, but it's easy for that transaction to be included somewhere else and then not end up having to pay any fee or something, which is a whole interesting economics thing that maybe Max you can.
Well, there's actually a lot of code that says you cannot, in Ethereum, for example, you cannot replace a transaction and have it fly around the network with a fee that's not at least 10% more than the one that you already put in. So the hope is that you don't, ladder up your fee and send the same around and flood everybody, and then everybody is peered. And so if you're with somebody who sends you garbage, then presumably you should shut them off. Although I don't think that behavior is actually implemented.
Yeah. You wanna, if anyone's interested in some nightmare fuel, just like search archive for like mempool, and you'll find some horrifying things in there. But all right, so. You talked a bit about the story on how it grew in Ethereum as like one of the more adopted like places for on-chain finance. Solana was running for a good bit of this time. So like, I'm assuming you guys had different mechanisms that also came up. I think people have obviously heard the term JITO and then lately some other stuff. So I'm curious, like, did the Solana ecosystem evolve the same way with this sort of like MEV fork of like the network client, or is there some other mechanism that currently today is how things went on?
Yeah, so we've had a slightly different path because we never had the public mempool. And because we never had the public mempool, people were sending straight to the leader. The problem was that, frankly, it just didn't work. The mechanisms and the code was not fast enough to process everything, and the mechanisms were not good enough to incentivize people to send things that were not garbage. And so we had a period of, basically in the scheduler, there was almost no logic that had anything to do with the fee on the transaction, or at least the way that it prioritized things that had high fees did not, in fact, mean that sending a higher fee transaction was likely to get you to the front of the line. And the thing that was likely to get you to the front of the line was spamming.
And it's not even just the mechanism, it's like the actual code quality. We had a lot of bugs. It was difficult in the early days to get a good estimate on who is the actual leader at this time. So a lot of transactions go missing that way. We were using raw UDP at the time, so we were subject to all sorts of DOS attacks. We had no way of differentiating transactions from, let's say, like staked senders or honest senders versus bots who were just trying to spam this transaction over and over again.
So that UDP stuff was all unauthenticated ingest. So like anyone could just send you a packet and you try to get it.
Yeah, and we had a best effort deduper. Basically, like it wasn't great back then, right? We've made a lot of strides from there.
Got it.
And like what you mentioned with stake weighted QoS, we use quick add ingest now, so we have authenticated connections, and then based on the stake that you provide, if you go through a stake sender, then we give you a higher priority through these ingest lanes. There's like 2 separate channels for staked and unstaked senders.
Got it.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah, but I mentioned sort of the state because it gave rise to JITO, which was sort of a Flashbot style mevgeth client. But it was different in that you couldn't really land in the normal way, in a consistent way. So they came out with Jito, and the original idea was we're going to build MEV for Solana.
Mm-hmm.
And what they actually ended up building was like a system where the priority matters
Hmm.
for the first time. And so they ended up having an even more outsized role than
Interesting.
MEV lanes on.
Because then even if you didn't have a transaction that had that much MEV, you would just go through that because it meant your inclusion was, you could have much better guarantee around your inclusion of your transaction if you paid a higher fee, basically.
Right. So I actually sort of, that was one thing. And then they decided like, we're going to make a mempool ourselves as well, so that people can search on it. And that actually got depreciated as well. So yeah, so for a while, Jito Agave or Jito Labs client was 96% of the network or something.
Wow.
And
the
so
Jito Labs client, I'm assuming, is just like a fork of Agave with some extra stuff
yeah.
in it to handle the auction. Yeah.
And then they had their own bundle engine. The bundle engine sent all or nothing river protection transactions. They also had a mempool, which has been depreciated. Initially, those bundle auctions were every 200 milliseconds. Now they're every 50 milliseconds.
Wow.
If you want, we can show like some pictures of what it looks like right now, where you can just see the 400 milliseconds. You can see that, like we have a video that's like you can see the Jito transaction streaming into the server on the 50 millisecond cadence. You have to
impress the revert thing work though too, because it's because the Solana virtual machine itself doesn't have revert. So like I guess they've like kind of added functionality via just how the block is executed too.
Yeah. So yeah, I have a really nice video that I made because one of our engineers just added a bunch of telemetry to the scheduler.
Nice.
You can see like all the transactions coming in at 100x slower than they're actually coming in, and you can see it checking them, and they all fail. Did they fail because another transaction in the bundle failed? Maybe we can put it into edit if we have time.
You're assuming a lot about my edit capabilities, but yeah, in theory, sure, yeah. Maybe a link in the show notes is maybe the way that we'll do that one. Yeah. Okay, so you got that going on, and then maybe the really interesting thing would be to touch on. So Solana, the slot times are 400 milliseconds. So how does a 50 millisecond auction work there? So I'm assuming it has to do something with the way the block is broadcasted, that you can kind of deal with block outcomes before it's fully complete or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, like blocks are streamed continuously. So you would have the transactions being packed in the scheduler. You're emitting shreds, which are like packets. And then every 50 milliseconds, when the Jito auction resolves, they would put in the transactions that won the auction into the block and stream those out as well. So the auction can occur multiple times during the block.
So I'm assuming you have sophisticated actors that like listen to the first shred that comes out and then like participate right away in the next auction. So they may have like multiple decision points in a single slot.
Yeah, I guess. There's this idea of like shred inclusion latency, which is okay, as soon as I see that my transaction has reached and been published in a shred, then I can get some sort of, obviously you don't have a full finality guarantee, right? Like the block.
Yeah, sure.
After something could happen, but it gives you some minimal confirmation that, okay, this has happened. If I get into the same block, I can build on top of the state. You know, the state is present in this block, or, you know, in a child block, whatever. Yeah.
I find it interesting, like the delineation from like block times from what the like actual decision point is for transaction inclusion. Because I think most people mentally think like, oh, I learn about a block and then I can do something in the next block rather than same block kind of interactions in this way. Yeah.
It's kind of similar to like a flash block if Ethereum people are sort of familiar with that for base.
It's kind of like a mini block or like a sub block.
Although we have it first, just to be clear.
I'll let you guys assert the primacy of ideas. Yeah. So okay. So that's how it works today, and you're telling me that's not good enough.
Well, that's how the protocol is defined today. The issue is that's not incentive compatible for the leader. And so the leader can make more money by not doing that. Maybe one point, like, why does it work that way? Because you have a pipe that says I can do 1 megabit per second. it doesn't mean you get to send 1 megabit at the end of the second, right? You have to send it spaced out the second if you want the megabit. If you send it right at the end, you get 1 kilobit because you send it the last second of the second. So that's like the reason it was structured that way, partly to give you faster response time for your transactions. The original idea was to build an order book on Solana. But partly because it also increases the throughput because you're continuously using the available bandwidth throughout the slot. Unfortunately, that's just not incentive compatible in any way. And what we've seen over the past year is that increasingly, first due to the introduction of the revenue scheduler, then due to these PBS style designs, and now we're up to, I would say, like 30% of the network is mostly broadcasting right at the end of their slot. So not
all the way at the end of the 400 millisecond, basically.
Right. They just wait till the end, pack all the transactions there, and then that's how they make their money. So
there's a paper from a few years ago, I think it was called like Strategic Timing Games and something like this, that talked, it was like an analysis of how this was also happening on ETH, where I think they have 4 seconds or something, and the value of the block obviously goes up exponentially the closer you get to the end of your like allowed window to get things out.
That's a slightly different thing though, because the timing games on Ethereum are how late I propose my block, which is sort of like the last shred set of the transaction delivery mechanism. And so we also had issues with that as well, but this is a slightly different thing, which is something that Ethereum never had, which is continuous streaming. We're doing continuous streaming, and then that doesn't make the most money, so people don't do it.
We have the technology is basically the retort there, but we're not using it any longer. Okay, interesting.
It's also like less scalable that way, right? If you are continuous streaming, if you're using air bandwidth equally, then you can push out more data. But then you also see a discrepancy in fees where it might be, okay, sure, I can pack on, like 100 more low fee transactions, or I can delay and then get some juicier fees on the hot state transactions.
Because you have a limited amount of data you can send out, and then you're basically using some of that like early on, when you'd be better off waiting to pack it until maybe more transact. Because I mean, obviously the prices dislocate from like what happens in the real world the longer time goes on. So like ideally the spread you can capture goes up. But
and then you also see senders like respond to this by escalating, right? So they send out their transaction, they see that they're monitoring the shreds, they don't see their transaction or any transaction that captures this ARB or whatever value come out. So then they're like, okay, let me try again with the higher fee, or maybe the ARB has now gotten more profitable.
I mean, there's an interesting body of work on how the arbitrage gets bigger as the time goes on. The reason is the amount of liquidity that's available increases as the price movement increases. So it's not just, if you just look at like a geometric Brownian motion, which is not a great model, but it's something, the sort of variance of the price movement is proportional to square root of time. So the variance is sort of reducing, the marginal variance is reducing as you increase the time window. But because you're able to take more liquidity when the move is bigger, the overall outcome is something like, I don't know, 3/2 in terms of the time, in terms of how much you expect the movements to be available in this very simplified model. But anyway, when you leave it for longer, it tends to get bigger, and the rate that it gets bigger increases.
Prices are stale. The more stale they are, the more money there is to be made.
There's nothing to pick off. If you're moving outside that spread, there's something to pick off. So
got it. All right, so different history because different underlying mechanisms. Solana, obviously, from the beginning has been designed to push the limits of scale. And it was designed very purposely to have this like really nice continuous broadcast mechanism to utilize validators' bandwidth fully, or as much as transactions are willing to pay for. Problem is, as soon as you layer on some more like interesting, let's call it profitable arbitrage opportunities on chain, it changes a lot of how you might want to leverage that bandwidth. And sometimes, at least with the way it's currently configured, that doesn't necessarily mean you're incentivized to scale, you're incentivized to make money, which may actually sometimes work against the way that the actual like hardware could or software could run. Got it. All right. So we got that established. So now, I mean, Totally has been talking about this for a while, as you well have, Max. Adding more proposers solves this problem somehow or makes it better. So let's start there. So there's been a lot of renditions of this over time. Like, I don't know if around like MCP v4.final-2 or something, but like, it's come a long way, let's say, from like some of the early considerations. So maybe you can talk us through like, why does having multiple proposers here help? And then maybe we can talk about some of the specific instantiations over time and try to like kind of end up where we are today.
Right. So just coming from like ground zero, what is the problem? It's that the leader can choose which transactions go in and in which order they go in.
Mm-hmm.
Early work on MEV focused on the reordering problem because that was the most obvious. That was what they were actually seeing in the wild. It was the first thing that you would see. Mm-hmm. So the fix for the reordering is, what if we did the ordering in the protocol? Instead of taking the block, replaying it in the order it was given to me by the leader, why don't I just put it in some order that I want, right? Mm-hmm. And that works fine. You can reorder it. Like, we know, like, just add a sort before you go to replay. Yeah. Like, it's sort of fine. Maybe there's a little bit of work here and there for what we call bankless leader, but other people call async or basically non-path dependent execution. Mm-hmm. But it works, right? But the problem is then you can still manipulate the order by including an insertion and censorship.
Yeah.
That's where the multiple leaders comes in. So the first step is to say, well, this is really a reordering problem. Let's try and control the ordering in the protocol. You find out that with a single leader, that's not enough, because you put the reordering patch on and then the censorship comes into being as the next thing that people are looking at, ways to insert transactions. You can imagine a sandwich attack being done with insertion, or or any number of things, censoring competing bids in an auction.
Sure. That's the easiest example I think about, is the auction one, where it's like, I'm the leader. Well, you could have all sorts of crazy reordering rules, but if it's only my transaction, I don't care. Yeah.
So in 2023 or so, we wrote this paper about an auction and saying, hey, these single leader chains don't seem great for running an auction because the leader can just censor you.
Yeah.
Turns out that auctions are sort of everything in finance, right? Even a central limit order book is also called like a continuous double auction. So we said, well, the way to solve it is not to have a single leader. Then we had this whole long path of proposals of how to solve that. The first one was called multiplicity, proposed by Elijah, who was a co-author on that first paper. And it became Fossil, actually. So it was the precursor to the Fossil design. It has a lot of similar features. It was designed for Tendermint first. The way it worked is you would have these vote extensions, and on the vote extension, they would include some transactions. The leader would have to propose a block that included at least 2/3 of the transactions on those vote extensions. So you can start to see, like, if you're familiar with the whole design, already some of the ideas, which is like, you have a bunch of people proposing an inclusion list, then you still have one leader to aggregate, because we're doing consensus. So you kind of still have a leader no matter what you do. But the issue is, we still want safety and liveness, which are these core consensus components.
Yep.
So we can't wait for every single message from every single person in the committee to arrive. Some of those nodes might be Byzantine or crash, depending on your assumption. They might go offline. They might not send you the stuff. You can't be waiting and stalling while you wait for them to send you a message. So they have this issue in multiplicity and in Fossil, which is you can guarantee inclusion of at least 2/3 of the messages, but it can be any 2/3. And so you can selectively choose which messages you want to remove. That was the first design, which was this multiplicity. It's also, I think it's heavily inspired Fossil. Fossil is different in that it's fork choice enforced, because Ethereum has a ghost-based fork choice consensus, not Tendermint. So that's the difference between the two. But
Yeah.
fundamentally, very similar ideas. Then we had another idea, which was Braid, which was, what if we just have like these separate consensus instances going side by side? The issue is like with that one, consensus is not super deterministic. Like it doesn't always terminate. It can always sort of cascade into the next period in a period of uncertainty. When you have 10 chains, you've increased the probability of entering a period of uncertainty on the whole view by factor of 10, which is not the end of the world, but we also realized around this time that we sort of might want another property, which was hiding, which was keeping the transactions out of the public view. And for hiding, we need to eventually reveal. So original idea was to do commit reveal. If we have this period where we might be out of valency for many slots in a row, that gets in the way of the hiding. So that's why we ultimately discarded that idea. Then we've sort of
because like to pause on that 1 second, because like in that approach where you have these like connected consensus constructions, my understanding is you basically do like almost like a round robin of those consensus constructions. And so like consensus 1 gets view 1, view 2, then you kind of rotate that way. And so like if with just like the natural perturbations of like the consensus running, view 3, for example, may become clearer before view 2. And then view 2 could then take the data that's in view 3 and utilize that in view 2. Is that some of the concern that you're referring to? Or are you thinking about, was that the hiding property a little different than that?
That's slightly different. So I guess you're describing, I think, what I would call Gatling, which is this very fast rotation of leaders, still a linear monopoly on ordering and inclusion. Is that right?
So I guess like the way I've always thought about it from like this like multi-consensus perspective is that you are trying to almost fill like a grid with heights, let's say.
Yeah.
And so the way that you fill the grid is like the width of the grid is the number of like consensus instances that you're running.
Yeah.
And then like the consensus instances fill vertically. They're a section of the grid, but you can't fill the next hole in the grid. Like basically it's done async. So like the execution is done after the fact once the grid is filled, or like as you move through it. And so what my concern is that in this grid, this box, and like you have these different consensus instances. If one gets ahead, because you don't want to synchronize them, because that'll all get probably pretty hairy. That if like, let's say row 2 of the grid starts to get filled before like row 1 is done, then someone could see the broadcast of like the row 2 component and know that there's something coming that they could then try to gain by being included in like row 1 of this grid. So this is my like high level, like call it high level or low level, I don't know, but like that's my conceptual understanding of at least that solution and like some of the ways you can play with it. But hiding, I think maybe you could also elaborate a bit on what that property is.
Yeah, that's sort of the idea. Basically, you don't want to allow people to see part of the transactions as it's being constructed. Include those in their own, and then you're sort of back to the world where we still have a deterministic ordering rule, but one guy is inserting transactions. So that's what we're trying to avoid with this hiding property. It's not something that we're trying to achieve in this first Constellation draft, although we think practically speaking, it has a lot of pretty good properties for that. But there is like a difference between what is the practical system, how hard is it to do in practice, versus what can we prove about the system. And it doesn't have the provable hiding property in this iteration.
Because I saw a number of notes here that was like it already assumes Alpenglow, which like let's not forget about that other huge change that you guys are also working on. So got it. So Alpenglow itself, to also clarify just for people listening, that can go live without any of this. This is something that comes on top of, or could come on top of Alpenglow.
Yeah, exactly. So like Alpenglow, we will launch it first, obviously, before this, and then Constellation builds on top of it. And when you finally get the leader block, it's kind of like you use the Alpenglow consensus pretty much with with like some slight modifications just on that leader block. Yeah.
So to back up one step there, right? You have like the rotor and voter concepts in Alpenglow. Rotor is very similar in a way to like kind of how Solana currently works today, and the idea is that you more or less replace that, or like I guess like maybe you could talk about how Constellation at a high level fits into that story, and then we can actually go into what Constellation is. Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, what Solana has right now for block propagation is Turbine. So the leader shreds their block into, I guess, these sub blocks that we call FEC sets, which are basically 32 packets of data that are then erasure coded to also produce 32 packets of coding data. If you get half of any of those 64 packets, you can recover the FEC set, and then these FEC sets comprise a block. Turbine is kind of like this tree broadcast. The leader sends a shred to a root. The root fans out to 200. Each of those guys fan out to 200 with current mainnet node count. That's enough to cover all nodes. And then rotor is the next step, which is, okay, let's not have multiple layers in the tree. The leader sends the shred to a root, and the root is randomly selected for each shred, and then the root forwards it to everyone. So that's how block propagation will work with rotor, and that's kind of independent of voter, right? So this can happen today.
Sure.
There are some issues about what do we do with unstaked nodes, things like that, but it can happen today. It can happen after we roll out voter. And then voter is the replacement for POH and Tower BFT. So Solana, kind of when it launched, we put together this innovation of proof of history, which is basically using a hash function to prove how much time has elapsed. So this allows you to synchronize the leader spans pretty efficiently. So figuring out, okay, I've waited enough time for the previous leader to propose their blocks. I am allowed to start producing my block. And then each node in the network computes POH so that they can verify that when you produce the block, you attach your POH hashes. They verify that, okay, this guy waited the appropriate amount of time. He's allowed to produce the block right now, and it helps you resolve any sort of disagreements that happen there. It's not perfect. It also is a little bit wasteful as our engineers.
Because that eats one core basically on the like anyone on the network, right?
Yeah. On Agave, like we just have core 0 just spinning at 100% the entire time. These hashes, right? And it's also like, there are some small variances between nodes in the cluster on speed, and then this is also being used to the earlier problem of some of our original transaction sending mechanisms used the POH to figure out, okay, who's the leader right now, right?
Got it. So you wouldn't know ahead of time, and then all of a sudden it's this leader, and you have to try and get the transaction done.
Right, and then I guess you have your schedule of leaders for the next 2 days, like every 2 days, the schedule. But then you're using POH to figure out, okay, where in the schedule are we, basically. So then any variance in POH computation, or sometimes, your POH runs ahead because there was some sort of consensus issue, so the blockchain slowed down a little bit, or maybe it was faster. So yeah, I mean, it's an imperfect timing mechanism, and it's expensive. And so with Alpenglow, it's okay. Let's remove POH first of all. We can use local timers, right? So each node maintains a local timer of the block time, and they don't have to be tightly synchronized or use any sort of crazy mechanism there. We have standard votes on blocks, and then when we reach some sort of decision on the previous leader, we can start the timer. And it's okay if these times are a little bit out of sync. And then the other thing is alpenglow is based on, kind of like the simplex family of consensus algorithm, whereas Tower BFT is more of like the longest chain variant. In Tower BFT, right, like you can't explicitly vote no for a block. Instead, you or the next leader has to build a competing block, and then you wait till one of these forks reaches a certain length, which is also why in Tower BFT we have pretty long times for full finality, right? Because we require at a minimum 31 blocks must be built on top of this block. So the fastest finalization, full finality, is like 12 seconds, right? But then in alpenglow, you have this notion of a skip vote, vote, so yes or no. You reach decision much more quickly. You can prove that, okay, this block will be finalized within 150 milliseconds. So
not for the faint of heart, definitely ripping up a bit of what people know about Solana, let's say. And so Constellation basically goes in front of this, is kind of like the thing that sits, like, so you have alpenglow coming with like rotor that's distributing like what the leader's data is, and then voter like kind of working on finalizing that. And the idea is that instead of this like direct broadcast or kind of this like, whatever external party driven block building, you replace the front of that with what basically becomes Constellation. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of it. Maybe we should talk about what erasure coding is, because I feel like it's so simple.
Yeah.
Really simple to explain. The basic idea is if I'm sending a message over a noisy wire where messages could get dropped, the naive thing to do would be maybe I just send the message twice.
Yep.
Now I have this probability that the third position in the message I was sending got dropped. Still don't know what I sent. So the idea of erasure coding is I want to send a message with redundancy, but such that the redundancy isn't to a particular position in the message. Sort of I can drop 3, or I can drop 7, or I can drop 2, and the redundancy will allow me to reconstruct that missing, regardless of which one it's missing. And it uses polynomials, which are like this very simple thing, but there's this property of polynomials, which is that they're uniquely determined by an nth degree polynomial is determined by n points, or n plus 1 points, is it?
N plus 1,
N plus 1.
The degree of n is defined by n plus 1.
Yeah. So you have this mapping back and forth where if you have a polynomial, you can take n plus 1 points, evaluate it at those points, and get a bunch of points in our n plus 1. And if you go the other way, you can do this interpolation and go back to the polynomial. So what we do is we put this thing, take our data, which is in our n plus 1, map it into a polynomial, then add a bunch more evaluations, map it back into our 2n plus 1, and now we have a polynomial which has, which is still of degree size of the message, but actually has twice as many points as you need to recover it. And we can drop any of those messages. You still can reconstruct the polynomial, and then from the polynomial, you can go back to the message. So this is sort of the main technique behind erasure coding. It's why erasure coding powers Turbine, which is way faster than the old legacy peer-to-peer sending. But it's still robust to Byzantine nodes because it's erasure coded. So
that's the magic of 1960s math.
It's so sick. And it's wow, why didn't we use this for blockchains before?
I was looking at it the other day, and like the paper that it was proposed on is like typewritten, and I was like, damn, some ideas just withstand the test of time.
Read Solomon encoding.
That and Merkle. But so we got erasure coding. And I think, any of these new chains, and like we've obviously spent a lot of time on it too, is like moving to this erasure coded broadcast. It ends up, just for a lot of reasons, being better. It's like a whole different way to think about the chain. So you can't just like slap it on usually to what you do. Sometimes there's a way to kind of organize it that it's easier to adopt, but like the best wins, you can kind of integrate it deeply into it, can really have some crazy results. So continue. So
we're going to use that same property, which is any of these things can get dropped. And we're going to link it back to that old fossil style thing. Remember, we had this issue, which was that we had this committee of people sending in, the proposers would send in their inclusion lists, and the leader could selectively pick off a few of them in order to maintain the liveness of the protocol. Okay, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to let you remove a few of the shreds, but it's erasure coded, so we don't care if you removed a few of the shreds. And that's the core technology behind what was this MCP White and Howe paper, and now inside Supernova, but also like other protocols like Sedna, and it's this idea that you can use erasure coding to provide censorship resistance, because you can pick off a few of the pieces and you still could reconstruct the transaction because it still has enough pieces that make it into the block.
So maybe to ground it and like kind of how someone should think about this is, so maybe talk about the flow from like, I'm a user and I submit my transaction. Where does this go through this? I'm not going to call it a Rube Goldberg machine, but this layering of erasure coding. Yeah.
So the user sends their transaction to the leader.
Yep.
Sorry, the leader. User sends their transaction to a proposer.
Yep.
Proposer erasure codes it along with some other transactions into forward error correction set, and sends shreds from that set to 256 attesters.
Okay.
Those attesters send their shred along with a attestation. The attestation is sort of across every proposer's shred that they sent them. So if Patrick and Ashwin are proposers and I'm an attester, I get a shred from Patrick, I get a shred from Ashwin. At the end of this cycle deadline, I say, I got this shred from Patrick, I got this shred from Ashwin, and send that off to the leader. Then the leader has to include at least 50% of the attestations. Forgot what the exact number is. We've gone through so many different parameters.
Yeah, 50% or 60%.
It depends on, there's two ways to do it. We have a quick release version where they have to,
whatever the LLMs say, is best.
Yeah. The slow release version where they only have to include 50%.
Okay.
So one of those numbers, you have to include all those attestations. And the way it is constructed is that given our assumption on how many nodes can be Byzantine, and given the coding rate of the transaction, we are able to prove this property that we call selective censorship resistance, which is the leader is going to include enough attestations that if you sent your transaction to everybody, a few Byzantine guys up to F cannot keep it out.
And the leader can only include transactions that come from this mechanism,
right?
In my understanding.
So, that's the way we've done it, because you don't want the leader to have a fast.
Otherwise, it just goes totally around the whole concept.
Yeah.
Exactly. So to the backup, right? Like people talk about consensus with like safety and liveness, and the pitch, I think, like of Constellation is that there's actually a third property you should also care about if you're doing like meaningful on-chain finance, and that's what you called. Maybe you can repeat that. Selective
censorship resistance. And
okay.
The basic idea is if you send a transaction, it gets in, or all of the transactions don't get in. Like the leader could go offline and then maybe we stop producing a block. But as long as some transactions are getting in and
yours is getting it in.
Yours is getting in, which is really important for trading, because I want to get my cancel in, and you're like the leader and you're a taker. You don't want to include the cancel that's going to stop that opportunity being available.
Okay, so maybe it makes sense to think about how people, or like maybe traders or whatever, or like different entities here would try to break this thing to prevent something like that from getting in, and like what are the things that prevent that from happening. Okay, so like let's say I don't want a block from this proposer to get in. What are the mechanisms, I guess, specifically that prevents that from happening? Yeah.
Right. So I might try to selectively choose different attestations to leave off.
Yes.
Those might be the ones from the people who said your proposal didn't make it in time. But as long as you made it to sufficiently many people in time, because of the erasure coding, we'll still be able to reconstruct the block, and you'll still be in. So even if I choose to exclude up to 50% or 25% or 20%, 40%, depending on the parameterization. We have several different ones, but I'll choose to exclude a bunch of these guys, and then the erasure coding is enough redundancy that even when I choose to exclude those people, they still make it in. And that's how the proof goes, at least, which is they can exclude up to this many. That is not enough to exclude them because it's erasure coded at a rate that's higher than that.
Yeah. I think something to note here is that these shreds coming out of the proposer are erasure coded at a 1-to-4 ratio. So it means that you only need 20% of the shreds to reconstruct the entire block. And then that's where these percentages that Max is throwing around come from. Depending on your security model, like if you assume that 20% or whatever are Byzantine, so then you have these attesters that even though they saw your shred, they might drop they might not be from the attestation. You could have attesters that attest to you, but then don't forward the shred along. And then of course you have the leader who can selectively pick, certain attestations or other. So with all of those parameterizations, because we have this 1-to-4 redundancy, the proof is that you still cannot censor just this proposer.
So to propose a block, the leader then has to include at least half of the attestations that should exist, is the claim.
Yeah, half or 60%, depending on which you have.
Is it 70% in the?
Or
I think it's 75% in the one that we put out. Yeah. Sorry, we have two different versions.
I already see white paper. This is white paper V0.9. So I can assume that there have been earlier drafts and probably later drafts.
Version, which is faster to get the shreds out, where we treat the attesters as relays in rotor, and we send the shred to everybody.
Yeah,
that one has a 60% inclusion threshold because it lines up with 20 crash, 20 fault, and then the other 60% is 60% of the people could be Byzantine, so they could, or 20% of the people could be Byzantine, so they could lie about that 20%. Now we're down to 40%, and then 20% of people could say that they've seen a shred and not release it, which gives us down to 20%. So we have a 5x coding rate there. The one that we put out has a 2x coding rate, but the shreds come out slower.
Yeah, I guess something to touch on is this idea of like what I talked about earlier about shred inclusion latency, and what are really the latencies here, because for different users it's different things, right? So one of the advantages of going to multiple proposers is if you have sufficiently a big enough set of proposers, then chances are that there's a proposer that's in your locale that you have very fast latency to. And then if this proposer is honest, they can give you an immediate ACK that, hey, like, I'm including your transaction as part of my proposal. And then, so that's a very quick ACK that, is not going to be as strong as seeing a finalized block, but gives you some sort of information to trade on. And then the idea that there are multiple proposers means there's some game theory on, disincentivizing a proposer to lie to you, because then you might just stop using that proposer. And then there's a second level. It's like what people use today, which is, okay, did I end up in these shreds, right? Like when I saw the shreds come out, I'm operating a node and I see the shreds flowing in through rotor, is my transaction in there? And then you have the strongest version is like, okay, and then did the block actually get finalized, right? And currently without MCP, that first proposer ACK, that thing doesn't exist because you can't reliably trust every single leader. And then the two different versions of Constellation that we're talking about is there's like a trade-off between bandwidth and this erasure coding and delaying the shred inclusion latency, or keeping the same shred inclusion latency we have today, but then taking a bigger toll on bandwidth. So we'll have
how many confirmations, different levels of confirmation do we have in like 300 milliseconds? Like we have proposer ACK, we have shred ACK, we have, did the leader include enough attestations that made it into their block? Then we have a notarize on the leader block, and confirm on later block.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming like the path forward on like some of that stuff is really just like more tightly coupling it with the mechanisms that exist in Alpenglow to avoid.
Yeah,
like
then it's not
basically.
the same.
Yeah.
It's a little less clean than we
Sure.
do this thing than we do Alpenglow, because now rotor is sort of part of this design. It's not too bad that we still do Alpenglow voter on the leader block. It's just that rotor is sort of like
different.
spike legs extended.
Yeah, because a leader then has a different role, like what gets broadcast or who broadcasts what.
Right now, the leader is not broadcasting any transactions at all. All they're doing is broadcasting this attestation aggregation, which is way smaller. Maybe they can alter all that. So then we save another map around. Yeah.
And the idea then is that the attester is the one that actually like. So does the proposer also send it out to the whole network, or is it proposer to the attesters, and the attesters are the ones that actually like propagate that?
Proposer sends to the first layer.
First layer, and then the first layer is then what?
The first layer fans it out to everybody, because we have like 1,800 nodes or something. We have 800 full like taking, operating, validating nodes, and then we have another like huge RPC nodes that are also receiving shreds. So even if you have a 1 megabyte block, then it would be 3 gigabytes to send it to everybody. Rest. So we obviously can't do that. So the fan out there is already part of the protocol.
For those curious, balanced broadcast is a term that's often used for some of this stuff to help the network distribute the load of because you would think the naive way of sending a whole block around everyone's probably good enough. Turns out you can do a lot better. So there's a whole different episode we have on that one too. So if you're curious about that, check it out. Like and subscribe. That was with Monad and like the Category Labs folks. It's pretty good because I was curious about the RaptorCast stuff and how that was different from like some of the Reed Solomon kind of approach to things.
Is it better or is it fake?
There are some interesting properties, I think, of like the RaptorCast, particularly like the fountain code approach to it. We did a lot of benchmarking and found that like oftentimes very short digression here. There are 2 ways people tend to do this thing. The first is very similar to kind of how you guys do it and what Monad does, which is that you have this like distribution layer and you only vote once you actually can reconstruct the full block. And so for things like that, like you don't have to do this like as much of this like Merkle proving and like all this other stuff to prove that the data exists. It's like, did I get it? Great, I'm going to vote on it. Some of the more advanced constructions now, like you vote on your chunk. So you don't actually have the whole thing by the time that you vote. And then after that, you then have to reconstruct the block and you know that it must exist because so many chunks exist. And then there's this like separate certification step. I think I don't know if Alpenglow does this thing, but this is at least what we do. And we like couple it into simplex much more deeply, which just means that you just have less of a delay. Like we don't have to wait for the full 2-hop network propagation. We get the block at the same time that you get the notarization. So it takes 1 hop out of the latency. For that, Reed Solomon is probably as good as you can do. And the bottleneck is actually the Merkle side of it, not the Reed Solomon side. So like the advances you get from like pushing the encode, decode faster are like negligible to the amount of time it takes to just do some of the hashing. But in this other mode where it's like pre-block distribution, where like you only vote when you get the block, some of like the RLNC stuff and some of the fountain code stuff is really nice because you don't have as much of the overhead of these other like constructions there. But it depends a lot on your goals around like how you actually lay out the block dissemination and like at what point you want certain things to happen. So there's some merit. It just is a little different because you don't always know exactly that this many chunks lets you recover. There can be weird edge cases where like you have to have a little bit more. And so if you're a protocol designer or an engineer, that sometimes you need a little bit more is very weird. Because then someone that has the thing like kind of introduces some jitter to it and then generates a new chunk that you can cut. So there's just a lot of other ways to maybe look at that problem. So for like a P2P network, I think Optimum, I think is the name of the company, is doing a lot of interesting stuff with RLNC for like a P2P network. It doesn't have the same latency properties, but like it has some really nice properties for like a full P2P network. So for what you guys are doing, I still think Reed Solomon is probably the right place to play. And like, I'm not sure that some of the benefits of some of these other coding schemes actually make as much sense when you have some of the properties you need, because it just doesn't end up being as much of the problem. Like read Solomon's fast. Like you can SIMD that thing and like it's fast, and so usually that's not the problem, at least as far as we've seen. So,
and you guys
have
deliver us in pieces. Is that what it's called?
Yeah. So we got really into the erasure coding stuff as well, and obviously, as well means we don't have anything in production that's using it yet, but our next project that we're releasing uses it heavily to push the throughput with some erasure coding stuff, which should be pretty cool to see. But nothing nearly as battle tested as like Solana and what your guys' usage of it has been. But ultimately, the thing that we get really excited about is the balanced broadcast component of it just makes the chain a lot more stable. So the very interesting digression here, which I want to do an episode on in the future, is basically the difference between what's called extractable SMR and then SMR. And so in extractable SMR, you just prove that, F honest or F+1 honest or 2F+1 honest have the data, but you don't guarantee all honest people get it. So on the proposal path, you may have to go fetch something. So this is a lot how like a lot of these DAGs work, is like they assume that like basically it's available. Yeah. You may just not be the one that is the one helping to make it available. And so if you want like a chain to hum, which is usually what you want, you can have some cases where dishonest leaders just withhold the data and you have to go get it then from the network. And I mean, anyone that's looking at a protocol that's like, well, sometimes you have to go fetch the data, like, your timeout's blown out, right? Like it doesn't, especially with like the variance on like the latency of internet data, like it can be wild how much that can derail. So like one bad leader can then just blow up the next 2-3 if you do it, if it's so bad. And so the really nice property of erasure coding is that you can't withhold as a leader, right? Like it's a lot, because if the next layer that broadcasts the data, then you basically if the leader, if the block gets notarized in the simplex parlance, that that all honest parties will receive the data or like be able to reconstruct it within one more delta, which is a really great property. Yeah,
you can read off the block ID from the shreds themselves. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So you structure it in a very specific way that, yeah, exactly. You basically bind the block to a commitment and a block hash, and then you distribute a chunk. And then basically during recovery, you deterministically know whether or not that broadcast was correct or not. Okay. So the cool thing is you basically, you interleave it into the voting stage rather than waiting to vote until you have the data.
Right. Yeah. And do you have to condition the finalized vote on availability?
So that's the really cool thing with Simplex is, yes, you can basically avoid ever having junk getting in the actual canonical chain because of the voting rules of Simplex. So it flows together just quite right. And so I have to give credit here to Victor Shoup with like some of the dispersed Simplex work and like Sing a Song of Simplex, who saw this connection a couple of years ago and seems like no one really ever did anything with it. Brilliant. Like the way that he found a way to like kind of tie these things together. So we took some twists and turns, but the core insight I would credit to him on like that you could actually pull these things together in a really, really clean way.
But quantum with these things, by the way. How does this thing work when you have a 1500 byte packet and 666 of it is the Raptor or Falcon? It's the Falcon. Falcon.
Yeah. That's a whole, that would be hopefully our maybe episode 7 for how things work. Is like how to get your head around quantum. I mean, I think ultimately, it's related because, it's bigger, right? I think that's the spoiler alert for a lot of these things. And so if it's bigger, like you best be using erasure coding then. Although like the question is like, is Reed Solomon, can you game that? Like with commitments, I think it's safe. Like you can probably wrap it in enough hashable commitments that like you can protect it from like having some misuse, but like, I don't want to speak on like the postal.
That's the issue.
Yeah. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. On every thread. So does the shred blow up the,
Whole nother problem. Fortunately, hopefully we still have 3 years to deal with it, but we don't know what Google is telling us or not about what their quantum computer can do. So much to consider. But yeah, ultimately, blockchains need to move a lot of data around. And there are a couple ways to use that data. One is with this sort of like a extractable SMR that, like, if people actually push the data they say they're going to push and the internet is fast, it's pretty stable and you can increase throughput. But one or two bad eggs can totally blow up and like kind of really affect the stability of the system. And so I've instead come to the point where I really prefer like the balanced broadcast style with a leadered consensus protocol, because it really is hard to fuck with if you're like a malicious leader. And that property I think is really nice for a lot of different systems. And so that's where I've focused on. But yeah, I have not spent as much time on like the pre-consensus kind of censorship resistant, maybe like concerns. And so I think where I've seen people have a lot of questions, and I think this would be a great one to touch on, is like, if you're a user, like, how do you protect me from like messing with this and like getting my transaction in a bunch of times? Because I think that's the first question, at least I see people, is like, well, so you're telling me I can send it to 4 people now. Do I have to pay for all 4? Or like, how does that work?
Yeah, so this is the fee payer DOS, which is one of those questions. Like, there's a few questions that people inquire.
I see this all over Twitter. Like, it's not safe. There's all this junk in the chain. Yeah.
So obviously we thought about that one. These are the types of questions that core dev people think about, and then everybody else just assumes it's taken care of. Oftentimes it actually hasn't been taken care of. But in this one, we did think a lot about it. First of all, each transaction, the format is that there's a proposer key. So you're targeting a specific proposer. You can't send the same transaction to a bunch of different proposers. You got to send a different transaction because there will be a different signature, because the transaction body will be different. So that's the first thing. Now we still have a bunch of problems, right? Because we have multiple proposers who can include fees from the same fee payer account, so they could drain each other's. And even more of an issue is you could pull the funds out of the fee payer account with a transaction in one of the other proposers. And then we're doing it every 50 milliseconds. So we have this like sort of uncertain period of a few 50 millisecond cycles that hasn't actually been observed yet by consensus. So we have a whole mess here. But the key idea is you just keep a little bit of funds in the account, and hopefully those funds, like, it'll be like 0.001 SOL or something, which is, I don't know, 10 cents. And we already do that for rent. We do that on every single account type except the fee payer account type, which is the normal account. So the normal account is the only thing that is exempt from having a little bit of funds in there to hold rent. So we're just going to have that on the normal accounts too. And when you send a transaction, we'll have this reserved balance that you can't transfer it out right away. You have a certain rate limit that's associated with that, because you can't send too many transactions. So that you would be able to drain this by sending way too many transactions to everybody. And then if you want to drain that, the last little piece is like, you want to take that last little piece out. We're just going to hold it for, say, 400 milliseconds. Just to make sure that in between the time you try to drain it and that 400 milliseconds, you weren't trying to send a bunch of transactions, then it will just through as normal. And so that turns out to work well. Like, we can prove that as long as your network is in synchrony so that everybody is observing a head that's at least not too stale, then we don't ever have, as long as everybody's honestly obeying the fee payer check rule at the proposer level, we would never have a fee payer transaction that doesn't work. And then we might still have it if there's like asynchrony, but if that happens, we're just gonna not execute the transaction. And we should never happen. It should never happen under normal operation. If things are stale or if one proposer's way behind, then they might include stuff, but it really only hurts them. The bad thing is if it hits every single proposer. That's the real case.
The lens I've always looked at it is like, do you have enough protections that an honest proposer, in this case, can act in a way where they can protect themselves if they want to? And if you can't assure that, then it's broken. at least like my gut check for mechanisms. And then in terms of from there, yeah, what you guys have done with on like earlier mechanisms I worked on around this, I think it was called VRIX, was the one from a while ago. Had this thing, similar concept. It was called like an account fraud proof, which is like you had some amount of money and no honest user would ever go into that reserve. And if they did, you're done. Like you get sidelined, or like I'm not going to touch it anymore. I think yours is a little less punitive, which is that if you get close into the reserve balance, it must then be topped up, or like the existing transactions fail, but the fee is deducted. Yeah.
Right. It's like a really small amount. It's sort of, you would already pay this if you were opening a new account on Solana that was anything but a normal account.
Yeah.
We're just extending that so that every transaction will have, like every other accounts will have rent, and this one will have fee payer balance minimum. You can even raise it if you want a higher rate limit. So if you're like a trader, you can.
So that was my question. Is like the size of how much you like reserve is basically how many transactions you can push through the network at some time. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. That period of like uncertainty where you don't know how many transactions could have hit this fee payer account. The more funds you have, the more certain you can be of that. And then you also have some other things where it's like, certain accounts cannot be a fee payer, right? So the proposer knows that, okay, withdrawals out of this account or movements of money out of this account are fine because it cannot be used as a fee payer elsewhere, and then cause problems there. There's also some schools of thought where it's like, okay, we should leave it up to the proposer, like have the proposer front all of the fees for their proposal, and then they get paid back if the transactions can actually afford to pay the fee. And then it gives proposers like an avenue to compete on by having better selection, having their own heuristics. But even in that case, like we have to provide a same default, right?
For the other proposers, basically, to be safe still, I think is the protection mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. So
And so then the idea is basically that reserve, I'm assuming the trivial kind of math there, like you basically take the reserve divided by the number of proposers that are configured, and that's kind of like your rate limit per some unit of time. I think you guys use this term cycle here and there, and then I think there's like a larger concept, which is like cycle plus lambda or something, where it's or like delta plus lambda, that is like your timeout period or something like that, where like that's how often it refreshes. Is that right?
It's three-dimensional, right? It's number of proposers, and the rate limit is over time as well, over that delta plus lambda. So
got it.
Three things. The fee times the number of proposers times, and then that comes in, I guess, in the denominator. Yeah.
Got it. So some user comes into the system. This is how it works now. So they have some amount of balance that they put aside. I'm assuming that's some sort of special transaction when they set up their account, or is it just based on what their balance is, I guess, in the account, that they have some amount that sits there that's locked up unless they send a special like close account or like withdraw transaction, and they would not know any different other than that they need to determine really like how many of the four proposers they want to send their transaction to when they broadcast something. And that's really the only thing they'll see.
Right, and even which proposer to send to is going to be chosen by the wallet, right? Not chosen by the user, unless they're a sophisticated sender who really cares about that.
Who gets what? Yeah,
and then go ahead. Most of these like non-time sensitive, like a simple transfer, right? Like there's very little reason for them to broadcast it to every proposer. It could just be simpler, like always send it to one of these guys, and if it doesn't work, then send it again, right? After some time. But it's usually like the more sophisticated people that will want to send it to certain subsets or multiple of these proposers.
So you get these like things included. You have a few transactions in now, and we've sent the like things out to the attesters, and then the attesters have continued to send the shreds out everywhere. The leader gets attestations. They ultimately like put a bunch of them in some block, and then that thing now gets finalized. So now we have a bunch of transactions, some of which may be duplicates. How do we pull it all together?
Yeah. So we want to do priority ordering, priority per CU, which is like priority per gas if you're head. But we have this thing called parallel execution, which is not part of the EVM natively, which is that we have multiple threads. So we still want to preserve that behavior as well. That we have this sort of greedy virtual scheduler that assigns things to different threads, and it actually increases throughput massively. It sounds like it would be like this thing that reduces throughput, but what it actually does is preserve the existing parallelism that we have within the SVM. And it sort of makes it so we don't need a global CU limit at all, because our boxes are big enough now and we've had enough performance improvements that most of the cores are sitting idle at any given time. We can just, if we ever have global congestion, like we don't have enough execution capacity for transfers or whatever, we'll just add another thread there. Like we'll just add another core that's working on execution. So we can sort of have this global limit that's almost unbounded, or it's bounded, but we won't hit it. And then we still have this local limit, which is the critical path of transactions that are writing the same accounts. That's sort of the way it works, like this greedy list scheduling algorithm that just puts stuff on threads, and we can go over a certain amount of execution that we think we can do on a critical path.
And then this also gives you like local fee markets, right? Because there's some hot account, high priority fees. A transfer is scheduled on the separate thread in parallel. It doesn't have to pay a lot of fee or any fee.
So you get this list, and then it sounds like it's just very trivially like ordered kind of by, I suppose just by fee is probably like the way that loosely is going. Or is there not even that preliminary order?
We get a blob of unsorted transactions from many people. We smush them together. With the list. Okay. Which we can do.
No execution, right? Just sort in.
Some people thought that it would take a while. It's like it's n log n. Like we can sort 1 million transactions a second. We can sort 1 million transactions in like 4 milliseconds. Anyway, we take that thing, we sort it, then we draw the dependency graph downstream. So if you have a lower prio per CU and you're conflicting, then that's the end graph. Then we pipe that whole thing into this scheduling.
Got it. Okay.
And that is the assignment onto the virtual threads. And then everything gets executed that way.
Okay. So the intuition here is basically I want to trade in some way or participate in what you would call an internet capital market. And transaction gets in, you can ensure that you're going to get it at whatever fee price you want to, because you can send it to more proposers, or the idea of this selective censorship resistance. It gets into a block. Those proposers have no idea what are in the other blocks. And right now that's not totally guaranteed because there's not hiding yet, but that is something that could happen in the future. But let's just assume for now that there's basically they don't know what's going on in the other blocks. So they just include whatever they can that there's like a valid transaction that pays the fees. That goes through this pipeline where you have shreds that spread out. Attestations end up in the block. So then when people actually verify and finalize it, they know the shreds exist. But then when it's finalized, they can execute it on a shared set. That set is then ordered, deduped, and then like mapped to the existing execution engine. And then that emits basically the outcome for whatever the state machine is. Okay.
We collect the fees first too. We don't execute until we collect the fees.
Okay, so the transactions before we even do anything, you deduct their balances basically on the fee side. Got it. Okay. All right. And so I think my dumb question here is like, if I'm trying to optimize my I think that the term you guys use a lot is like microstructure, like kind of like market microstructure here. It feels like the more you know about, or like the more certainty you have for like how that transaction is going to be executed, like the better you can price things, the better, maybe more smartly you can interact with the system. With a system like this, there's a lot I don't know, I guess, until like that list of transactions is pulled together. I'm curious, like if that I'm on some like, is that an interesting question, or am I missing something of like how people think about this sort of system?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I do think it's like a very common, there's some stuff that has happened organically on Solana, which has sort of violated the premise of what I would call tick to trade thinking, which is what you're saying. Whereas for a long time, this heuristic of the faster I get information, the faster I can react has been true. And on Solana, this is not true because people are not waiting. It's already too slow to wait to react in some ways. So if you look at Solana transactions, trade transactions by volume, a lot of the activity are these optimistic bots. And the way it works is my trading system has I spit out a fare that I'm willing to trade at, and it goes and it like tries to hit the pools, and if they give them a good price, then it will take it, and if not, it just fails. And they fail like 95% of the time. So in some ways, there's like black box of execution that we don't observe. A lot of stuff is going on in there, and it's already you might get it 30 milliseconds, you might get it 40 milliseconds today because a lot of our nodes are in Europe. So if you're in Europe, leaders in Europe, you might get
Amsterdam, right? Is the place to be? Yeah.
Frankfurt, I think has even more than Amsterdam now, but
I think it's changed a little bit.
Really? Oh, now that we told them to move. Anyway, basically, like you get these acts pretty fast, right? But they're not fast enough to react to. So if you're doing some kind of, there's a lot of optimistic behavior, and I really think that is, if we look out 10 years from now, if trading does actually happen on blockchain, this is going to be how it is. More and more of what we call the order execution part of the trading strategy is going to happen inside the execution engine of the blockchain, which has zero tick to trade. It's on-chain co-location essentially. And then you still have this huge outside world perspective that you're sort of smushing as much of that information, maybe compressing it because it's still a blockchain at the end of the day. But you're posting that onto the chain, and then your algorithms that do the order execution side really do live inside smart contracts or programs. So that's sort of how I think things will go. And I think we're already seeing that direction on Solana, on Sol USDC and other pairs where a lot of the activity on both the maker and the taker side is ODEX lives inside the contract or the program. Oracle update pushes something or pushes an optimistic take transaction, which has a fare that I'm willing to take out inside of it.
Yeah.
And I query all the pools and see what's up.
So the idea in that world basically is your responsiveness is irrelevant. It's like more like I have a price I'm willing to pay and a fee I'm willing to pay that price. I need to get that in. And so I want to make sure that I can get that in.
Irrelevant is maybe too strong, but I would say
I'm not a trader, as you can see.
It matters if you are doing a strategy that has legs on multiple venues, which matters. Like expectation is linear, so my edge is still linear, but I might have a strategy where I think the price is going to go for 30 seconds and then come back. Okay, then I need to trade out on the other leg when I think the price is coming back. So if you're doing a lot of stuff that's only on Solana, like if you think of Solana as a universe, I don't think it matters that much. If Solana is in the loop with Binance, then
that matters.
If it's back and forth, that's when it can matter.
Yeah. Okay. So there's more machinery here, but the idea is that like with what happens on chain, you're going to want to, like most people's strategies will involve some on-chain component, and really like what matters to you in that world a lot is just making sure that you have censorship resistance or selective censorship resistance to be part of that execution flow. It's basically at the end of the day what you should care about.
Yeah, make sure my Oracle update gets on so that my bot can do what it wants to do.
And that's where this like inclusion latency also becomes really important. I want to be able to get my transaction past that point of reaching in the tester as quickly as possible, because then in some ways it's like locked in where you can't censor it. It doesn't need to fully propagate to the entire cluster, but it's reached this point of like, okay, it's going to be included.
Got it. And I mean, I think this comes back to is like, I guess it's interesting that very few chains have done this, I think, to the level that Solana has, but like, this is optimized for markets and trading, and like that's going to seep deeper into the protocol design. And so I'm curious how you think about that. I mean, I think Solana as a whole, like it seems pretty clear that that's the direction you want to go. And so for applications maybe that don't benefit from something like this, because it just feels like a lot of extra steps for something that maybe is not relevant to my application, is the claim there that like, well, the applications that really should be here are the ones that this matters for? Or do you think that there's some trade-off to consider here? Like, well, if I'm a payments application, like this like really not complicated, but like sophisticated fee market maybe doesn't matter as much to me. I guess it'll still work well anyways. Is that kind of the idea there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a payments company, I don't want to see you on Solana. Go to Tempo. I'm obviously joking. I think a lot of the things that you want to see in a payments application are high reliability, low fees, low latency, and you're probably less sensitive about those things. But if we can get the system to work for trading, I guarantee you it's going to work for payments too.
Yeah.
And we have these local fee markets, so something crazy can be going on the pump account and on the Patrick O'Grady Ashwin account.
Yeah.
I can send back and forth between those without too much.
We're minting some NFTs. That's what we do still. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like, and I think that's really the experience today in many cases, is that we've gotten better and better about the trading activity being less and less disruptive to the other stuff. I do think there is a important point, which is that payments applications on their own drive much less revenue, at least right now, in protocol, than trading.
Yeah.
So, like 97% of the protocol revenue is trading related transactions. And the other 3% is like Patrick O'Grady sends.
I mean, the theory, right, is that the network profits more on priority fee. Is that the concept? I guess the other thing to think about is like, I mean, unless the payments are priced at some rate that is like some delta over what the network makes money on, you need a lot of payments, whereas you maybe need people that have a priority on a lot less trades. Yeah.
And it's important to note here that payments in these other applications also benefit from this design, right? Because they still do get the increased reliability. And what Max was saying in the beginning, where these scheduler wars cause all transactions to be delayed, right? Like they don't just delay the trading transactions. Some guys are delaying everything. Your payment there now can be processed faster because you've just generally improved the transaction pipeline of the network.
I suppose that the interesting counterpoint would be like, because you have increased the reliability for transaction inclusion, if you want to get a payment in and you are willing to pay to get it in, you now have much more certainty in theory that like this is now going to get in. And before, like it may be less clear to have that happen with the current structure.
Right.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think it does make it better for payments, but if it made it worse, I wouldn't care. So like, I mean, I would care a little bit, but like in the trade-off space, the thing that drives 97% of the revenue is going to be the thing that we focus on. And we are doing some things for payments. Like we are lowering rent. So we're still working on payment stuff. But when we think about like, okay, we have 97% of our revenue coming from here and 3% coming from here, what are we going to optimize the core protocol for? It's going to be the 90%. And if it was the other way around, we would be doing the other.
And the reason why I ask is like, I mean, a lot of these are so, there's a lot of thought that goes into them. And so it's interesting to think, I mean, like there's very few, maybe no trade-off free decisions. And so I ask it as a way to see like, as you think about the space, like maybe there are ways you could have done the inclusion that had different properties that, maybe are different for different applications. And I think for a general purpose, like virtual machine, like what Solana has, there's a lot to consider because you don't know necessarily what applications people are going to throw on it. But yeah, I mean, I think like, especially over the last few years, trading has been obviously a huge focus of what you guys have designed for. And I mean, if you want to be the best there is for that, like you'll do what it takes to be the best for that.
Another way to
think,
is
yeah.
like with a high contrast level is I don't think you should do MCP on tempo, for instance, because if you're actually going after the payments use case, I think a lot of this it's extra complexity. In some cases it's an extra round depending on the design. It's less throughput. In some cases, if you don't have to worry about MEV and all it is just sending money back and forth, then go make a really nice pipelined simplex thing like you guys have made, and it's really good for payments. If you care about DeFi, you absolutely need to do this. And I think it's almost existential for what we have seen so far on Solana is that because this stuff was not here, and not only because of that, many applications that are new applications trying to build trading, people who have been in the Solana ecosystem for a while, wanted to build complicated financial applications and did not want to do it on Solana because of the uncertainty and uncontrollability and inconsistency and unverifiability of the transaction scheduling layer. And if you're building a really complicated app, if you're building a perp dex and you can't get your liquidation in because it gets censored, then your exchange busts and it's over. It's not coming back because you actually just got wrecked. So that is something that I think makes people really uncomfortable when they're building. And we saw it in the data. It's not like something I'm making up. The data showed that a lot of these very smart, very talented Solana-aligned teams chose to build in a way that the matching engine and the core risk engine logic was not on chain. And maybe they just didn't get it, but in my opinion, they did get it. They saw the trade-off space and they said, the best thing for my business is to build off of Solana for the most sensitive ordering dependent aspects of the chain. So we don't want that to happen, obviously, because it means we get lower revenue and the activity has less of a network effect. So part of it is in response to that.
Yeah, my follow-up question was going to be should all chains now, is what you think of as the gold standard for every chain having MCP, or is there a certain class of applications that if a chain wants to work well for, this is a non-negotiable? And it sounds like at least for any sort of on-chain finance, you need to run it. Anything that ultimately resolves to an auction needs something like this. Is maybe the way to think about it, or is it even more broad than that construction?
Either you're centralized and you keep your client closed source, and you keep a group of people that you have a lot of a weight with, and those are the people that run your client, or you do this. And I think the third option of being an Ethereum chain where you try to do finance and you let this dark forest grow into a black jungle of intermediaries is not it. It just doesn't. It ultimately it's hard to see it failing because it's so slow over time. But then you see an app that could have been built on Ethereum, right? It's built on the EVM. They're trying to build a perp dex. Why is it a centralized L2? More and more of this starts to happen, and you don't immediately realize that it's because PBS exists. But it is because PBS exists. It is because the chain is slow. It is because of other things too. But you have to start to see those as they're coming, and it's almost a counterfactual. Could Bullet or Bulk Trade or any of these other off-chain have been a really nice big perp dex if they had built directly on Solana?
Yeah.
No, but we know that they built somewhere else.
So, the way I'm interpreting a lot of this is that the dream of on-chain markets is still alive. We just need more on-chain to to make that possible. And I think at least this, in terms of this selective censorship resistance, is the missing piece. Maybe there's one or two small tweaks to it to remain to really bring it there, but that censorship resistance is the foundational requirement. And unless you have that component of it, all the other stuff you want to do just doesn't really hold up in the times that you really need it to.
Probably need a few more after this one, but it's a big rock, and I think the other ones are going to be easier to slip into place. This one is really sort of fundamental in how the
sure.
works, and so I think it's where a lot of bottleneck is.
You're telling me we're not done after this. There's more work to do.
Fortunately not.
Someone, you got to stay employed somehow. I mean, you got to give Ashwin something to do.
Ashwin is going to be a lifer.
5 more years.
How many quarters is that? A lot.
Well, we've been going for a while now here, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap things up. You guys have already been pretty generous with your time. The last one I wanted to give you guys was, since this came out, almost a week ago now, or a week exactly. Are there any other things you've noticed that people have concluded that maybe was incorrect, or clarifications you wanted to make following that people would maybe want to hear from you guys?
A couple spring to mind for me. First is that you can send to only one proposer, and that proposer can see your transaction, but nobody else can. It's coding. It's all or nothing coding. So you don't really see the transaction until it gets. It's not. A lot of people have this misconception that you would send to a proposer and he would send it to everybody, and then everybody can sandwich you. It's like, no. Well, there is a guy who can sandwich you. It's just the proposer, not every proposer, which is nice because we have a lot of senders that are already seeing the flow and they're not sandwiching people on Solana. Triton RPC, Helios RPC. A lot of people are offering a service who also happen to have a lot at stake, where you can send to them and they're not going to sandwich you. So that's the idea: is you would send to the people that you don't believe are going to sandwich you. Right now, if the validator is a sandwicher, you either have to wait or you send it to them and they sandwich you. So that's the one misconception. And then I think the other thing is, we have a couple different designs with different spots on the latency throughput trade-off.
Yep.
And Tolly says, always sacrifice bandwidth for latency. Obviously, there's some that's a little bit of a totality,
there,
but we have a couple different designs that are different points, and so I think we're sort of thinking about which one of these is the right one to do. And I think a lot of the feedback has been like, hey, why is this slower than Alpenglow? And we have one that's a lot faster. It just used a little bit more bandwidth. So I don't think that the one that we put out is final, but we wanted to get it out there because everybody's like, hey, where's this thing? I think it's time for it to be a public. It was mature enough that it can be part of the public discussion now. And we're fundamentally Anza is an open source software organization, and that's in our blood and that's our culture. And so we wanted it to be out there and for everybody to discuss it.
It's being discussed. Yeah.
Definitely being discussed.
Yeah, I would also say that 80% of the engineering effort is just enabling this kind of multiple leader mechanism to work, and then 20% of it is I get a lot of questions about why 50 milliseconds or this type of batching window. What is the actual merge rule? Are we the specifics of sorting, things like that? And I think there's a lot of disagreements. Even me and Max disagree on a lot of these things, and the idea is to make a framework that's extensible. If someday we want to change some things, it's hopefully easy to slot it in or out, change the number of users, the windows, things like that.
Yeah, it's pretty modular. So I think if you wanted to do a different merge rule, add some revert protection, maybe you want to try and do first come first serve. The ordering rule there is really call this thing that is it's all in the protocol already. So you can just switch it out with one PR. Right? It's not this whole huge.
Maybe not one PR, but it's flexible.
PRs can be as big as you want them to be, Ashwin.
Just put them together, whatever that was.
So very happy with the architecture that we're going for here, and then from there, there's a lot that can be tuned and augmented once you have this sort of concept of proposers to testers, and then how that flows through the network. Yeah,
right. We can add this sort of pre-shredding so that the transactions themselves never even touch a proposer. Hidden the whole way through. We might be able to add hiding with threshold encryption at the end. There's a lot of sort of good bones here to build on top of when we realize exactly what the properties that we need that are most important are. But this one is sort of so fundamental that it's a big deal, right? We're taking the right to propose transactions or them however you want away from the leaders. So of course that's going to be controversial, but I think it's the right direction for the protocol.
Cool. Well, I think that's a great way to leave it. So yeah, thank you both for taking the time to walk through this. I think it's definitely out there in terms of on the design space, like trying new things to see what can really make block space more interesting, I think is maybe one way to put it. And I think there's a lot to continue to explore there. I certainly don't think we're at any sort of global maxima yet on how to best use this stuff. So it's always really cool to see teams experimenting with what can be done and really like pulling different parts apart to see what new properties can be unlocked. So yeah, best of luck with the implementation, Ashwin, and best of luck with more work for Ashwin to implement, Max.
Curated for you, Ashwin.
All right, I'll click the recording end, but thank you both. Yep.
Thanks.